see what I can do here. But
The keynote speech of the seminar is going to start. Please turn off your cell phone or put it on silence. And please put on your mask in the conference. Thank you for your cooperation.
伊凡，请开始串流，谢谢。
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming this morning.
They're connecting the
stream. Yeah.
5 minutes in 5 minutes. Distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, people who are now watching our live stream video worldwide, welcome you to the Academia Sinica Taiwan and our Facebook streaming for the seminar of 2020 Indigenous Knowledge, Environmental Governance and Sustainable Development, a dialogue from local to global, organized by CTPIL's Science and Technology Innovation Center for Taiwan, Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies. We are grateful for the long-term collaboration with our partner institutions, Ifugao State University, Philippines, Save the Ifugao Terraces Movement, Philippines, University of California, Los Angeles, United States, University of Hawaii at Manoa, United States, and also partners from Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and indigenous communities in Taiwan. We are grateful for the support of Comparative Austronesian Perspectives, the Mandic Research Project Research Group, Academia Sinica, Department of Ethnology, National Chengchi University, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, National Chengchi University, and Social Innovation Laboratory, College of Social Sciences, National Chengchi University, also the support of the Ministry of Science and Technology, Taiwan. The first session today is our keynote speech, Challenge in Knowledge Production and Environmental Governance in Southeast Asia. We invite Dr. Courtney Work, Assistant Professor of Department of Ethnology, National Chengchi University, to be the moderator of the keynote speech today. Please welcome Dr. Work.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for coming this morning. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Miriam T. Stark, who is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and a director for the Center of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, in the United States. Professor Stark has worked in Southeast Asia since 1987 and has co-directed field-based archaeological projects across Cambodia for more than 22 years. in collaboration with Cambodia's Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts and the Apsara Authority. Her international collaborative Cambodian research uses multiple methodologies to address early state formation and political economy in the first 2 millennia CE, from geochemical ceramic studies to household archaeology. 2 of her current projects, Pattaya, Cambodia, co-directed with Dr. Allison Carter at the University of Oregon, United States, and the Khmer Production and Exchange Project, co-directed with Dr. Peter Grave, Dr. Elisa Kielhofer, and Dr. Ietarit, examine Angkorian period residence and economy. Her archaeological projects blend research with capacity building for Khmer archaeologists and include heritage management in their long-term research designs. She also currently serves as the director for the Center of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, which will begin a 5-year Luce Foundation funded project on agrarian and urban transitions in Southeast Asia this January. Her doctoral research in the Highland Philippines with Kalinga women potters informs her perspectives on indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia. So with her long history, she has much to teach us, and I'm very pleased. Please join me in welcoming Professor Miriam Stark.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Dr. Work. And thank you to CT Pills for inviting me to come speak. I'm just checking here. Can you hear me all right? Would you please wave if you can? Good. So I entitled my paper, Challenges in Knowledge Production and Environmental Governance in Southeast Asia, because I think it addresses some of the key issues that academics like me and people who are at the universities face when they try to involve communities in both practicing issues like environmental governance and research. Knowledge is essential to environmental governance or forms of collective decision-making and action that are aimed at protecting the environment and resolving conflicts over natural resources, and usually involve the government and non-governmental actors. As different types of indigenous or traditional ecological knowledge become increasingly important to environmental work, more scholars seek to actively decolonize the work that we do. Until recently, a loosely woven transnational collective of largely non-academic organizations has worked with indigenous communities on environmental and social advocacy. Activists and policymakers, not academic social scientists, have dominated this collective. Yet many social scientists also now seek to decolonize our research with indigenous communities. We should all be doing more, but blending research with community engagement with descendant communities in practice remains a challenge. Even in subfields like my own of anthropological archaeology, where major efforts have been launched, communities have taught us that we need to make a lot of changes to be effective. Knowledge production lies at the core of this issue, and in most cases, researchers still have what we call epistemic authority as the primary knowledge makers and benefit more from their projects than do the communities that they study. With few exceptions in anthropology, the most conscientious work with indigenous communities bifurcates in one of 2 directions. One endpoint, which remains important, are types of community engagement and research that offer new insights into what we study and develop trust with our research communities, but yield few research results whose academic publications net credit for the project or data that can be used for policy change. The other direction involves limited efforts whose integration of indigenous perspectives challenge conventional paradigms in important ways, but don't really help the communities so much. Participatory research in environmental governance must yield tangible results that we can use to help indigenous communities with real-life problems. And social scientists can play a much more important role in such work. This process of knowledge democratization, as Sonia Atale puts it, lies at the core of such work. So the question that I ask in this presentation is, what would it take to build a culturally appropriate research program whose goals include developing more equitable forms of environmental governance with indigenous concerns in mind? I use this presentation to interrogate my field. Next slide, please. Next slide. And social science more generally, about the relationship between knowledge production, research, and environmental governance in Southeast Asia. Experiences in both public archaeology and in Southeast Asian anthropologists' efforts to promote community-based natural resources management offer both best practices and cautionary tales. Let us begin by defining the terms. Next, please. Next, thank you. Let's start with the notion of Western knowledge, back one. Thank you. Western knowledge production, which is based on three legs. The first is what we call theory or explanatory frameworks that encompass the full range of human experience. And in archaeology, we talk about theory as sets of principles. The second component is epistemology, which is either how we should investigate the world or how we know what we know. And thirdly is ontology. It's the source of fundamental principles, but it's how we view the world. And in order to understand Western knowledge production, we need to understand how theory and epistemology and ontology are related. Next, please. There has been a call among different indigenous communities in anthropology to decolonize knowledge production. And for that, we credit Linda Tuhivai-Smith, because she was one of the first people to actively challenge methodologies, that is, how we know what we know, our epistemology, and how we view the world through anthropology and the social sciences. In fact, if anything, more than 20 years ago, she pointed out deep flaws in the way we do our work. Next, please. In this book, which has now become a standard text for my colleagues here at the University of Hawaii who try to pursue Indigenous social sciences. Next, please. She makes it very clear about Western knowledge production. She says the word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many Indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence. It conjures up bad memories. It raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. It is so powerful that Indigenous people even write poetry about research. So next, please. So here are qualities of Western knowledge, which is empirical, tries to be scientific and objective, based often on logical positivism, depending on testing, siloed into different specialties with domain experts, with notions of truth. Is Western knowledge steeped in a Euro-American worldview so deeply pathological as this kind of theory claims? And we call it post-colonial theory. Next, please. We might say that, and we might just give up on doing research at all. And it is the case in anthropological archaeology that some people have walked away from research to work only with communities, with descendant communities, and they've done very good work. But one of the goals in archaeology has always been to try to help people with their land claims and with issues that are related to environmental governance. And that kind of walking away does not produce data we need in order to fight those battles. We can't solve many problems by reducing them just to this critique. Next, please. And there are archaeologists. Next. Next, please. Including an Indigenous archaeologist with whom I've had the pleasure to work in national service, who talk about knowledge democratization. They recognize the weaknesses of Western approaches, but they don't discard it entirely. And there is an increasingly loud voice among the scholarly community that we can't just use binary kinds of oppositions and reduce all Western knowledge to a colonial frame. Increasing numbers of Indigenous scholars both recognize the elitism of Western post-colonial scholarship, but also the need for us to reconcile these different ways of knowing, or what we could call these different ontologies. There are many problems with Western knowledge, and there is a lot of value to the decolonizing critiques. But what I'm interested in here is how knowledge is used by whom, in what context, and for what purpose. And knowledge democratization, I believe, is the way forward can't only proceed with scientific knowledge that's steeped in this Western colonial past, nor can we effectively work in Western or even non-Western state-level institutions without a recognition of concepts that undergird science. So I would like to talk about how we might be able to blend them together. And for that, I bring some of my experience and research working with Indigenous groups in the field of ethnoarchaeology, and I repackage that knowledge to talk about this issue. Next, please. It turns out that ethnoarchaeologists who study potters like me find out a lot about Indigenous knowledge. This is not my photograph. My colleague working in Cameroon, Olivier Gosselin, took it. But we developed an entire edited volume about how people learn and about processes of apprenticeship, because as we learn and study traditional technologies, part of what we study is how people learn to learn. Next, please. And so we're studying one component of Indigenous knowledge. Next. We know it's locally rooted. Next. It's orally transmitted. And here you can see a potter and she's telling her daughter what to do. She's also showing her. It's a kind of practical engagement in everyday life. And that woman who's showing her daughter how to make a pot has learned that also from her mother or her aunt. It's distributed across individuals. Not every woman in her community makes pots, but some do. And where I worked in the Philippines, there were what they called factions of women who learned to make pots. And they traced back to a great-grandmother who had made pots. And it was only those women really in the community who made pots. So it was a form of Indigenous knowledge. So I'm going to take that idea and ask Sonia Atale to help me. Next. She's not here. She's in Massachusetts. But here's a picture of her on the left. She says, I'm Sonia Atale. And she's working with some other people. She's an archaeologist. She's published on Near Eastern archaeology. She's also been an increasingly prominent voice in trying to change the way that we do our work and combining activism and community-based approaches with the kind of Western knowledge that we need in order to make policy changes. So she has this concept of braided knowledge, which is a book coming out soon about it. And she's arguing that instead of rejecting Western knowledge or privileging it, we need to braid it, just like you braid a sweet grass basket in North America, in the area she's from. To make a basket, you have to bring together many pieces of grass, and that's what gives it strength. So she's arguing that we need to braid our knowledge together, different strands of data, different ways of knowing, those that are from diverse public audiences, from descendant and local communities and academic spaces. She recognizes that this kind of braiding brings friction, but it also creates strength. Archaeologists are increasingly trying to do this. It requires vigilance and recalibration, and it requires what we might call epistemic humility. But we've learned a few lessons along the way, and they fall within this whole rubric of engaged knowledge production in the social sciences. So next, please. My question is, next, can we braid academic and community knowledge to achieve our goals? And I'm going to try to be very optimistic here, a bit of an idealist, and say, I think we can. And I think that academics can get involved, particularly in Southeast Asian issues, and I hope in Taiwanese issues, as some already are, who are part of this consortium. But I think we can mainstream it more and change the field so that the field recognizes it as a valid approach. So let's talk next, please, about engaged knowledge production in the social sciences. Next. I'll very briefly talk about definition. Next. Origins and relevance. Engaged knowledge production is not simply activism, although activists occasionally become researchers, and researchers not infrequently shift away from research to produce activism. It's not just citizen science, although many of us work with citizen scientists. And it's not only federal compliance, although many of us have done federal compliance and have been involved in participatory research through that means. Its origins lie outside of academia largely, and sometimes in the field, particularly of climate sciences, but of some other very practical fields involving different indigenous and descendant communities. The terms come from the industrial workplace, and there are pragmatic goals. Urban planning talks about it when people try to modify their cities. And this idea of engaged knowledge has become increasingly important in environmental protection, especially with the emergence of community-based conservation. I'll return to this later. It matters because it offers a model that we can bring into this space that involves academics and non-academics as a way of working together effectively. Any practicing social scientist who's listening to me knows that this is what you already do, although sometimes it's difficult to get your voice across because it gets buried in the white literature. But it's not as common as it should be in academic departments. And actually, archaeologists, I believe, are farther along in this regard than many, but not all cultural anthropologists, not because we're better people, we're not, but we've been forced kicking and screaming in this direction. And we've been forced in this direction because of changes in our field. Next. So while this is a rather recent slide of Hengki Paul, a recent PhD from our department, doing community engagement with school kids in Siem Reap, this is becoming more familiar in archaeological circles than 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And the reason for it is because of our unique perspective. So I'd like to talk very briefly about a kind of engaged archaeology. Next, please. Archaeology is well suited in many ways for engagement. As Sonia Atale points out, we work in transdisciplinary teams. We routinely interface with a variety of publics. We work on ancestral remains. When I work in Cambodia, the Cambodian students you see in all of these pictures, they can trace their ancestry back to the people who built the temples where we study. So we have a kind of imperative to do this kind of work in a way that other people might not. And I've done it through several projects, one of which Dr. Work mentioned. Next, please. You could say, next. There's historical accident. In the United States, the rise of environmental protection laws, and also the Great Depression, and a variety of other economic and political events pushed us in this direction. We have a series of environmental protection legislation I show on the left, from 1906 through 1966, through 1979 to 1990. And it's only in the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that descendant communities have had much of a voice. But archaeology itself has been involved. Next, please. So it's a bit of a historical accident, but it's becoming an occupational requirement. And it's an occupational requirement for archaeologists working all over, whether we work on historical sites in North America, and we ourselves are North Americans, at least for several generations, or whether we're Cambodian and we work at Angkor, like M. Sokrati. So this need for local sensitivities and outreach is something that's developing in our field, and it's teaching us a lot. One reason, next, please, is that we can't avoid it. Next. Most archaeologists in the United States do this kind of work, and you can see in the lower left-hand corner the Capitol building for the United States. We train most of our students to go into the practicing sector, and many of them will end up working with a variety of stakeholders. Next, please. We can't avoid it. Because they're in the practicing world, every time a project is proposed that's a development project that requires some sort of mitigation, we have stakeholders. In this case, we're still struggling to get the kind of MRT that you have in Taiwan, and it's been 20 years. And there are lots of stakeholders. Some are the indigenous communities. Some are chemical corporations. Others are commuters, and we have to work with all of them. Next, please. Also, in the area of repatriation, we've learned quite a bit. And it's been forced on us in a good way, as Native American populations have insisted that they have patrimony over their own ancestral remains. Next, please. Here you see some Alaskan community members. They're not so old, they're not elders, but they are at the Smithsonian, which has launched one of the largest repatriation projects in the country. And we've learned a lot. Many archaeologists have worked through this system. We've learned a lot about consultation. We've learned about the need to collaborate. There's been the beginning of the co-production of research, co-management, and certainly the collective ownership of materials. So we've learned a lot, not because we're better than anyone, but because we're faced with it and we can't do our work unless we agree to share our knowledge production. Next, please. So we can take that into Southeast Asia, and here we are in Southeast Asia. Next, please, where Western knowledge production dominated. I show this picture so that you can see ilustrados in Madrid. These were members of the Filipino elite. They were well-educated, and the Spanish felt that they would be excellent occupants or residents of empire, except that they also were the cauldron in which the revolutionary movement began. Knowledge claims can always be politicized. And even today, there is a great deal of discussion about whether Western knowledge has a place in trying to understand Southeast Asian history or not. But even some Filipino academics say that we'd better take care not to do this the wrong way. So let's go to indigenous communities next, across Southeast Asia. There are 11 different countries here that you can see now, and of them, they all have indigenous communities. Next, please. But in most countries, next, they are considered, sorry, back one. In most countries in Southeast Asia, indigenous peoples are lumped with minority groups or ethnic minorities. So here's a map with all kinds of people who are ethnic groups. But some people who are majority populations in some Southeast Asian country are considered ethnic minorities in another. In Vietnam, Chams are minorities, and they are in Cambodia. Hmong are minorities in Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. Rohingya are minorities. But then people like the Vietnamese and the Lao are also minorities in Cambodia, and Cambodians are minorities in Vietnam, and Chinese are a minority in every Southeast Asian city. So in most Southeast Asian countries, this term ethnic minority includes both people who are not of the majority culture and also indigenous groups. Next, please. Vietnam is a good example. Next. Because you can see that there's the Cham, there's some Cham women in front of a Cham monument. And you also see the Khmer women down in the Mekong Delta. But only in the middle do you have these indigenous upland groups, the tribal groups. And only in some places is that term indigenous used. Next, please. Next. So what does this term indigenous mean across Southeast Asia? It's a complicated term. And really, people in every country have an understanding of what they are. In Thailand, they're the hill tribes. In Malaysia, they're the Orang Asli. And in the Philippines, there are many different groups from the Negritos to the Highland Igorot. Next, please. In fact, next, there are at least 120 million and possibly 160 million indigenous people in more than 1,200 different ethnic groups across Southeast Asia. We have them from West Papua all the way into Myanmar. And in every Southeast Asian country, these groups are recognized as the original people. In Khmer, we say Chengchi Daum Pek Taik. That's the term right now for the people who are original and their ethnic minorities. They're always defined in opposition to the majority population. So they're called Chao Kao or mountain people in Thailand. A label that Ian Baird explains rests on its relationship to and distance from the Thai majority. Next, please. I could show, next. There are a lot of maps, and this is just one map showing that there are both ethnic minorities and there are indigenous people all over Southeast Asia. I have just two examples that I would like to bring up very briefly in my presentation today. And I'm sorry I don't have more time. But I bring them up because they're two examples where you have a clear clash between indigenous land rights and nation-state decisions, which from a Western point of view seem like a very important ecological step to take. I'm going to talk about only two countries because those are the two countries where I have the most experience. And I'll talk about the Philippines first and then Cambodia. Next, please. Sorry, so here's the Philippines and Cambodia. Next, please. Let's go to the Philippines next and talk about labels. I was interested to see that the first widespread use of the term indigenous in the Philippines didn't really occur until 1984. And if you look at the map on the right side of this slide, you'll see the big green blob in the northernmost island. It's not as big as the red blob in the southernmost island of Mindanao, but that green section that's in the northernmost island of Luzon, it says Igorot. And that term Igorot has been around for a very long time, but the term indigenous, it said, only was used when people from the green zone participated in one of the UN working groups on indigenous peoples in 1984. And the whole notion of activism started in conjunction with social scientists, one of whom was actually an Igorot, an indigenous person, in reaction to the Marcos efforts to install a Chico River Dam and also to extract land concessions from the land for major transnational corporations to come in and do logging and mining. So this term indigenous was not common before 1984. And the Cordilleras, that is the green area or part of the green area, was central to it. I have a picture here on the bottom. I actually showed it last year, I think. And it's a picture from 1984. So it's already some years on in the resistance to the Marcos administration's efforts to build the Chico River Dam. And in this particular sign, the sign they hold up and the photograph is in reference to an activist that happened to be Kalinga, like the ethnic group I worked with. And he was assassinated by the Marcos forces. His name was Makliing Dulag. And that was one of several galvanizing events that brought together people in the Cordilleras to talk about themselves collectively as Igorot. Next, please. So the term Igorot had been around since the Spanish, for better or for worse. And if you look on the left, you see the for worse. In fact, Americans in the United States were introduced to the Philippines largely at the 1904 World Exposition at St. Louis. And apparently one of the absolutely most popular exhibits was the Igorot village, in part because they ate dog, in part because it seemed as if the Americans could understand their civilizing mission. So this is what Igorots looked like, they dressed like, and people came from several villages from across provinces to be part of the Igorot village. And for some time, that term was a term of some derision and then of some shame. But after the Chico River Dam, there was an increasing belief that the term was not negative and that there was a way to use it to show pride. So on the right side of the slide, I show Tabuk City, which is the capital of Kalinga province where I work. And you can see that they actively embrace the term Igorot and Igorot nation, however it gets defined. But that term indigenous, let's come back to it next. Indigenous Filipinos apparently appeared first in 1984 at the UN, but they did not appear legally until the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or IPRA. And I think that many people in the audience are familiar with IPRA, especially people from the Philippines. In this, people were defined as indigenous if they were a group of homogeneous societies identified by self-ascription, ascription by others, who have continuously lived as organized community on communally bounded and defined territory, and who have, under claims of ownership since time immemorial, occupied, possessed, and utilized such territories, sharing common bonds, and so on. So that's what indigenous became in the Philippines. And it is this notion of indigeneity that we bring forward. Now let's look at how indigenous appeared in the language of Cambodia, at least in English, if not only in Khmer. Next, please. All right, so let's go to Cambodia. Next. Cambodia has many indigenous peoples, although you wouldn't know it if you lived in Phnom Penh. You can see on this map the green and the orangish and the purple and all of these different colors. And wherever you see those colors, these are ethnic groups, and many, but not all, are also indigenous groups. This is why I brought this up before. There are Lao, and the Lao are up towards the northeast, and they would be an ethnic minority, but not an indigenous group. Same for the Cham, which are the magenta colored areas. But you can also see that there are many areas where you have different groups, and Dr. Work will talk about some, I believe, and they have different homelands, but there's a decided clustering in the northeast part of the country. I don't want to ignore the Cardamom Mountains and other areas, but it's this northeast part of the country where you have a large number of indigenous groups. And just like in the Philippines, where you have indigenous groups in highlands that have all kinds of resources that the lowlanders would like to access, so you have that in Cambodia. Next, please. There's a series of land laws that were enacted, of course, you know, between 1975 and 1979. All forms of private ownership were banned. But as Cambodia came back online, and particularly after the UN-mediated elections, UNTAC, we see the development of different land laws. And it's in 2001 that the Cambodia land law came into effect that not only strengthened private property, but as you can see on the right side of this screen, also did allocate some indigenous community land. Now, let's keep going, and I'm almost done. Next. So we have areas with indigenous peoples in the Philippines and Cambodia, and they have named lands, and they're supposed to have protected lands. So it would seem like environmental governance should not be so difficult. But what we see in both areas is that, in fact, even with legal protection, we have the incursion into these lands, and not only by these transnational corporations that want to extract mineral resources or log. So I will very briefly point out two of these, because I think for people who are from the West and who like nature, it might make us feel a little uncomfortable. I'll start with the Philippines Mount Pulag National Park, and then I'll go to Cambodia's Virat-Che National Park very briefly. Next, please. In the Philippines, in Benguet Province, not so far from Baguio, is one of the higher points in the country. There's a beautiful national park, and it was established in 1992 as part of a system of national integrated and protected areas. So we have an area that's protected because of biodiversity. However, of this 11,500 hectare area, 8,972 hectares overlap with ancestral domain areas for the Ibaloi and the Kalanguya communities in this Habay municipality. Next, please. So this is just them having a party. But these people are now being told what they can and they can't do in this area that was part of their ancestral domain, to which they have land rights. They have a certificate of ancestral domain. These days, there is a call for indigenous communities, conserved areas and territories, and a better legal framework, or a legal apparatus that resolves indigenous people's problems with national parks while meeting biodiversity conservation targets. But my understanding is that this is an ongoing issue. Next. Let's go to Cambodia. We can go to Virat-Che National Park, which is in the northeastern part of Cambodia in Stung Treng and Rattanakhiri. And you can see it's rather small. It's right there on the border with Laos and Vietnam. And actually, the first effort was in the mid-1970s to make this area into a national park. as part of a tri-county trans-frontier reserve called the Indochina Tri-State Reserve for Peace and Nature. That's very important, that peace and nature, because after the UNTAC elections, King Sihanouk established in 1993 by royal decree an area of national protected areas across the country. But he was specifically interested in this area, and in part because there was still political instability there. Today, Virat Che is Cambodia's largest national park, 332,500 hectares in Stom Treng, so much, much bigger actually than the area in the Philippines. It includes lowlands near the Sesan River and uplands along the Lao-Cambodia border. It has areas of high biodiversity and lots of great animals, although the poaching is a big problem. But next, please. The problem is a lot of people still live there. In 1999, Ian Baird reports there were almost 12,000 people in 41 villages and 9 communes adjacent to or inside the park. Most are ethnic Brau, 55,000, with half in Laos and half in Cambodia. And the problem is the same. On the one hand, they're allowed to have their land where they live, but they can't access the resources they used to be allowed to access because this is now a protected area. It's a park. It's a national park. So for people who like to visit and trek, it's great. But for the people who just kept living there, it's a problem. Now, maybe it's a problem where academics could throw more weight. Some social scientists have already worked in this area. Next, please. But maybe we could do some more braiding. And maybe this is an area where environmental governance, that is, could use more help from people who understand the kind of grounded geopolitics that we study, and also the kinds of advocacy that we can work with. Next, please. There are best practices, some of which are coming out of Southeast Asia, and many of which are based in Southeast Asian institutions. Chiang Mai University has been extraordinary, actually, in running workshops. But we know, whether we're archaeologists working in North America or in Southeast Asia, or we're social scientists, that we need to involve the full range of stakeholders at each step along the way. And remember that research design reflects and reinforces knowledge production. That includes intellectuals from the global South and also concerted capacity building efforts so that local people have a chance to make decisions. We also have to understand the positionality of each stakeholder. We need to understand that our ontologies, the ways we view the world, are different. But just because they're different doesn't mean that we have to only use one. Indigenous anthropologists are becoming more common, and the more Indigenous social scientists who get involved in the process, the stronger the field will become. We are lucky that in many places we can work with local Indigenous organizations, and they have structure and ideas to help us. One very important practice to remember is to build flexibility into plans. What may seem like a rigid research design for a grant proposal has to be more flexible when you get out into the field. And one of the points that climate scientists working with Indigenous communities in the Canadian Arctic point out is that we need to be able to adjust and change institutional structures and even funding allocation as we go along. We need to be responsive to communities, and we need to work together with them. We also need to keep end goals in mind. We need to think, what are the desired results of this engagement? What do we want and need to know that we didn't before? And these are questions that people ask regardless of their ontology or worldview. There are more, next please. There are more points of intersection than previously believed. Next. And you can see that in all kinds of literature that's coming out. This is kind of old now, it's from 2013. But as we move forward in time, and as people start to read outside of their very narrow academic fields, they see that there's a lot more common ground than we imagined. And we need to focus on that common ground to move forward. In fact, there are even some roadmaps. Next, please. Next. And here's one that was just published 2 months ago. It's kind of nice looking. And it shows you how you can tack between academic and indigenous knowledge. And it recognizes that science-like knowledge is essential to environmental governance. So we have better models now than we've ever had to work with. And we just need to be patient. We need to understand that collaboration takes time, that we need to proceed with caution and with epistemic humility. Archaeologists will assure you, next please, that it's hard work in the best of times. It's cumbersome. And the challenge is whether we can form a braided knowledge of theory and practice. Western knowledge production alone cannot generate solutions to the problems we face. And we need to hear and heed all our voices. Thank you.
That's terrific. What a great, great talk. Thank you so much, Professor Stark, for your insights and helping us see this process of blending that we're going to have to be involved in. And so you talk a lot about knowledge production, which is really important, and this work of blending. In anthropology, of course, we've done a lot of work on that. And when we see instances of culture change, in fact, in my own work, I talk about this a lot, the way that a new way of being does not and cannot throw out the old way of being. It comes in and it layers in on top of significant symbols and significant ideas, keeping the base structures, but changing some of the ways that we talk about it and think about it. And so in your talk, you've done such a nice job of thinking about knowledge and knowledge production and what that means, especially in terms of archaeological research. And one of the things that I'm hoping we can also start thinking about is the idea of value and value productions. So I'm just going to make one kind of comment, question, and that is that one of the values that we see so often in these areas of natural resource management, of areas where there are natural resources available to be exploited, we have this real problem of value and whose values are honored in various moments of contestation, and the ways that these values are sometimes they cause complete disjunctures of understanding. So, for example, in the protected areas at Virache, the people's, and this happens with companies as well, I see it in Cambodia, that the people's homes and maybe their rice fields are not destroyed by the company.
Right.
But everything else around it is destroyed, or they are blocked from that. And the government and the company thinks that this is fine. Well, we didn't destroy their homes. But people say, yeah, but you destroyed everything that we use to make our homes and to make ourselves and to make our villages. And now you're using it for your stuff. So there's this, and I'm wondering, I just want to throw this out and maybe we can think together with it over the course of years, but there's this market mentality, right? I had one person say, yes, but the forest is like their grocery store. So you came in and you left the house, but you took the store. And that seemed to make sense to the people who were trying to exploit the resources. So there's this finding the right vocabulary to lay on top of the existing frameworks to help bring understanding and bring change. So that's a kind of a question comment, and you can just mark that. But let's open it up to others, and maybe there's other comments that we have in questions.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you so much for the very inspiring speech. Actually, I loved every part of your speech, including the philosophy of knowledge and the development of archaeology and the situation in Southeast Asia, the introduction of the what things are going on there. Every part, I love them. Here I have a question for you. You mentioned that we need to have some flexibility when we are engaging the community. We have to community involved in the academic work, so we have to keep the flexibility. I noticed that you have the term on your slide, and that remind me a lot of things, because when we have our participatory oriented work with the community, we start to know that the community has its own goal and the needs, and even the tempo to do things, right? Because, for example, then if this is a holiday or a day to go to the church or the day for harvest, then no people will show up, even you call for a community meeting, right? A lot of this kind of thing you have to adapt to the community's tempo and need and everything. Flexibility is important, and it also reminds me that we have many young scholars, including graduate students, has a very fixed goal and procedure they want to follow, or a proposal they take to the field, and they found everything is different from they expect. Then they kind of lost in the field. So I think the term flexibility is very important, and I think that will also kind of a hint or clue for us to have some reflection on the methodology of scientific study today. So will you further elaborate your idea of flexibility according to your experience? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daya, Professor Daya. I think everyone needs to be more flexible when we do our research. I remember one project when I worked in Arizona, and we spent, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months, maybe. We had this idea that in conjunction with an archaeological project with the local Native American community, the Tahana A'adam, we had a great idea for how we would develop a community museum for them. And we'd already mapped it out, and we would go meet almost every Saturday, and we'd meet with a different district. We'd meet with one district, and they liked it. Meet with another district, we like it. These are long meetings, and we'd explain it, and they'd ask questions. And we felt like we were almost there, you know. And then we went to the last district, and they said, no. And we had to say, no, we're not going to do it. That's a flexibility, right? We had to go back and say, right, so the communities aren't ready for it. They had valid reasons, and we had to be accommodating. I think as an archaeologist working in areas, you have to be accommodating. And I think one key, and this is not something that's been really very rewarded lately, I think, in anthropology, is a long-term commitment to specific communities. Now, the community I work with is a very big one. It's all the archaeologists in Cambodia. And I've worked with people long enough that I've seen people as students, interns, and bureaucrats, and even heading up to being secretaries of state. And I know a lot of people. And that's very important because everyone's different. And if you just go in and you do a lightning kind of research project, it's very easy to think that there's a monolithic community out there. And then it's very easy to be surprised later that you have to be flexible because you did not know that there were a variety of opinions, right? And that's a mistake that a lot of social scientists make. And that is a problem with Western approaches that try and generalize about whole communities. You know, this is something that's come out in some of your engagement webinars that you've been running this semester as well, that people have different opinions, and the most honest of researchers who are working will say that. For example, I'll use an example from where I was doing my research, although there are Ifugao examples as well. So we say, and I said, that the Kalingas and the upland peoples were opposed to the Marcos government. Well, in general, that was true. But the people who happened to be my host family for the almost year that I was in Kalinga had someone there who had worked with the Power Corporation, which was brought in to pay people high salaries to persuade them that actually it was a good idea to build dams, even though it would force relocation of communities, right? So there were local Kalingas and there were local people in the municipality I worked in, and they collaborated with the government. That collaboration happened in the 70s and early 80s. I was there 87, 88, and then back since. People don't forget, right? So my host dad, he ran for mayor in 1987. He couldn't win because everyone remembered that he had worked with the government, right? So you have to know that there are different opinions at different times. And even if in general, a group wants to engage in conservation, there will be, as some recent articles have argued, there will be indigenous capitalists. They'll have different views. Jonathan Podway has talked about how Jarai elite in Ratanakari want to convert commons areas to their own cashew plantations. June Pearl Brett had a parallel story actually about elite Ifugaos in an area once they had land claims. So it's very complicated. And I think there is a role for social scientists to come in and try and help sort this out, right? Advocates are great, and I love these NGO people, but they tend to see things in rather simplistic terms. So what social scientists, I'm seeing Courtney smile, what social scientists can bring is a deeper level of understanding. So much the better if they can also be social scientists who are indigenous. But from the webinars I've attended that you've been in, Professor Daya, even those people have problems in different communities. That's definitely true in Cambodia as well. My Filipino colleagues tell me, and my Thai colleagues tell me that you always have to accommodate. You always have to recognize your positionality. And just because you're from that country doesn't mean you're from that community. So there is this level of understanding that needs to be developed of the dynamics of the people. And you need to combine that with flexibility to recognize that, it's going to take a long time. And there isn't one optimal, there isn't one perfect right thing to do. And you need to be flexible and be able to say, all right, that didn't work. Let's try another approach. That takes a pretty deep commitment. And it takes a long time. So for me, I do it in Cambodian archaeology and we move forward. But sometimes I'm scolded and sometimes I'm told I do the wrong thing. And I'm glad that my Khmer colleagues will tell me that. They'll tell me, don't do this. I ask them. But I recognize even with that advice that there are only certain voices. And so I think being involved for a long time and developing credibility with communities matters. They make mistakes too. Everyone makes mistakes. You have to be able to be flexible.
Thank you so much, Miriam.
Very nice. Excellent comments. Do we have any other questions for our speaker? Yes, good. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Stark. As someone who came from the Philippines who were colonized by the West for almost 400 years, I really appreciate your presentation, especially on the decolonization part of knowledge. So I'm not sure if my question is really related to democratization of knowledge, but it seems that academics and scientists speak in a language that can be only understood by themselves. So, I want to know I want to know if you have tips on how we can democratize, this manner of scientists and academics. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I couldn't agree with you more. Archaeologists are probably the worst. Really, we're awful. We use all this technical knowledge. I feel like it's an ongoing education. And I showed one picture of my former student, Heng Pi Paul, and he was talking with kids. I think the more we're forced to speak with the public, the more effective we become at communicating ideas. And sometimes it actually changes the research agendas we have. And we realize that certain subjects that we held so dear to our hearts may be less relevant than others. But I think it's a matter of practice. It's kind of like learning a sport or a skill, right? You have to get some muscle memory, and that comes from continued work with people. I also find as a teacher, it's helpful to work with students because students don't know what teachers know. Of course, they often know things that we should know, and we learn from them. So between those two roles, as a teacher having to explain to students, but especially as an archaeologist working with the public, that's important. For me also, I work with and communicate with non-archaeologists in Cambodia. And their question often is, why does this matter? Why are you doing this? Why should we care? And so I think that that level of accountability is important. And that's what I was trying to point out. Not that archaeologists are better, we're not better, we're probably worse. But we've been forced to do it, you know, and especially when you work in an area and people say, those could be my ancestors' bones, you're putting in a box, and I don't like it. There was a very negative reaction to repatriation for some time, but I think that's over now. I think most people understand, and I think it's been a really good lesson, but it requires epistemic humility, knowing that you're not right, which is a kind of decolonizing, and it requires a heck of a lot of practice. I don't think I'm that good at it yet, but I'm better than I was 20 years ago.
So what a good answer. I have just a quick story on that. There's a professor at Cornell, the university where I studied, who was a fantastic mathematician, and he was one of the best minds on Einstein's theory of relativity. And he was asked to write an essay for a layperson audience and was required to not use any mathematical formulas in this essay. And he just tells this beautiful story about doing it because it was so hard. And but when he came out of it, he translated all of those things into regular words. And when he came out of it, he understood relativity in a deeper way than he ever had before. All of our jargon, all of our terms mean something. They symbolize something. So if we can remember to say what we mean rather than take that shortcut into the language games, that can help with decolonizing our processes. Good, thanks. Any other questions? Oh, we can't have any other questions. Our timekeeper has stopped us. Professor Stark, thank you so much for joining us for an excellent talk and a delightful conversation afterwards. I think we've all learned a great deal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stark, for the keynote speech, and moderator, Dr. Work. And it is tea break now, and we prepare some tea and snacks outside the venue, so please take a rest. And also note that you're not allowed to have your snacks in the conference room. Panel 3 will start at 10:20. Thank you.